On the 24th anniversary of the PlayStation's release in Japan comes the PlayStation Classic, a micro console created to cash in on growing nostalgia for Sony's first ever system. Following in the footsteps of Nintendo's own NES and SNES miniatures, this plug-and-play PSX comes bundled with 20 preloaded games, spanning iconic brands like Metal Gear Solid all the way through to cult classics like Intelligent Cube. The product, which comes bundled with 2 non-DualShock controllers, is a no-brainer as a novelty, but there has been some concern that the Japanese giant hasn't given it the love and attention that it deserves, with reports of open source emulation and a substandard selection of software. So is this a celebratory slab of plastic or a shameless cash grab? Hey everyone, I'm Sammy from Push Square, and in this video I'm going to break down everything you need to know about the petite platform in my PS Classic review. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and with that said, let's get into it.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
So first, let's talk about the PlayStation Classic's hardware, which, as you can see from the images and pictures in this video, has been inspired by the original launch model PSX, rather than its 2000 hardware revision, the PS1. Despite being 45% smaller in terms of pure size, the device is absolutely a meticulous recreation of the iconic console, including every ridge, icon and detail. So exact is the replica that it even includes the parallel port flap around the rear, despite the underutilised input being removed from later revisions of the console in the late 90s and beyond. There are 2 ports around the back of the unit, one for the micro USB power cable and the other for HDMI output. On top of the unit are all 3 of the PSX's buttons, with the reset button used to create restore points in games, and I'll talk more about those later, and the eject button used to simulate the disc changing functionality retained in titles like Final Fantasy VII. The main power button obviously turns the system on and off, with the booting process taking seconds. The physical buttons can feel a little bit squishy, and the lightweight nature of the system itself means that it can seem a little bit cheap in your hands, but this is mostly due to the nature of the beast. The plastics employed are more or less identical to those used in the original hardware. It's just that without an optical disk drive or any of the motherboard and all of the meaty internals in the original unit, it weighs practically nothing. This does obviously make it highly portable, and you could carry it around in your pocket if you really wanted to. There are 2 controller ports on the front of the unit which creatively connect using USB as opposed to the proprietary ports of the original PlayStation. This means that there's the potential to use either of the 2 included controllers with a PC if you're able to obtain the right drivers, opening up new possibilities when using emulators. While the memory card slots are replicated on the front of the system for authenticity, the console itself has a mammoth amount of onboard storage, so there's no need for any expensive extras. I should add that the packaging itself is a nostalgia trip in of itself, as it's inspired by the console's original box. Despite being a fraction of the size, the use of yellow and black colouring will definitely take you back in time, and the unpacking process has been lovingly designed, with the inner box revealing the diminutive device inside once you pull it free from the wrapping. In addition to the console and 2 controllers, you get a USB cable and a standard HDMI lead, but no plug adapter. Technically, you can plug the micro console into any USB power source and it will function, including the PlayStation 4 or a PC. Alternatively, you can use the kind of standard USB plug adapter that comes with a smartphone, and if you haven't got a spare one of these lying around, they can be purchased for peanuts from Amazon, so do keep that in mind. So as mentioned earlier, the PS Classic comes with two original PlayStation controllers. The pads come with ample cable and connect to the front of the micro console via USB. It's worth stressing that these aren't the DualShocks which Sony first introduced in 1997, so there are no analog sticks or rumble functionality included in the controllers at all. This is quite disappointing because it rules out software like Ape Escape, and it also means that titles like Siphon Filter must be played with the D-pad, which can be fiddly. It's still an iconic controller though, and it's been manufactured to the same standard as the original device. The smaller size does feel unusual when moving from the larger, more refined DualShock 4, but it's true to the original and the authenticity is what's key here. Sony's used the premium parts that you'd expect to find in an official PlayStation pad, so the split D-pad feels just as good as it does on the PS4's controller, while the face buttons are equally satisfying to push. The famous dual shoulder buttons are also intact, though true to the original design once more, the L2 and R2 buttons are slivers rather than the wider buttons that would later be adopted by the DualShock 2. Without any rumble functionality, the controller feels extremely light, which can make it feel cheap, but the plastic is robust and it doesn't creak or bend in the hands. Ultimately, it's not the most comfortable controller in the world these days, but it's more than capable of getting the job done. So as a plug and play console, the PS Classic succeeds in taking seconds to get set up. All you need to do is power it via USB and hook it up to your television's HDMI port and you're pretty much good to go. Upon playing the PS1's bone-rattling start sound, you'll be greeted with a short instructional menu explaining how the physical buttons on the device itself work, and once you exit out of that, you're pretty much free to boot any of the 20 bundled games. There are no real settings or options to fiddle with here. You can enable a screensaver which will dim the screen after 5 minutes of no activity, and this can help with burn-in depending on the kind of television screen you've got. There's also a power saving option you can enable which will turn the system off after a set period of time should you accidentally leave it running or something like that. Other than that, there's the usual licensing information and not a whole lot else to see in the menus. Those of you expecting basic emulation features like the ability to say stretch the games from their native 4:3 format to a widescreen 16:9 ratio may be disappointed to learn that there isn't anything like that here, although most televisions these days will crudely handle all of that for you. Naturally, there are no fancy border options either, and the PS Classic can't connect to the internet, so there are no trophies or leaderboards. As such, you can't connect to the PS Store either, so don't expect to be able to download more games at a later date. The user interface, while garish, has been themed after the original PS1's menu screens, so you get multicoloured buttons on top of a kind of 90s spherical gradient. There's an argument that Sony could have done more here, creating a flashier menu system that better represents each game, but I actually appreciate the attempt at aping the original PlayStation's dashboard, and it's incredibly efficient to use, getting you in and out of games in a flash. So the micro console outputs in 720p at 60 frames per second, and while image quality purists may balk at the resolution, it's worth remembering that the games have been untouched and therefore output at a kind of sub-HD quality. In most games, pre-rendered videos retain the artifacting and compression caused by squeezing them onto the PS1's original CD-ROMs, and therefore you're looking at some seriously grainy footage. Honestly, you'll either find this aspect endearing or seriously archaic. Each game comes with its own individual memory card, so you have absolutely mountains of space with which to store your games. One neat trick is that each time you push the reset button on the hardware itself, a temporary restore point will be created on the micro console, meaning that you'll be able to pick up your progress later without actually needing to create a hard save. But you only get one restore point and they can be overwritten, so you do need to be mindful of that.
This is Snake. Colonel, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. What's the situation, Snake?
Looks like the elevator in the back is the only way up.
Just as I expected. You'll have to take the elevator to the surface, but make sure nobody sees you.
So when building the original PlayStation, creator Ken Kutaragi embarked upon squeezing technology ordinarily reserved for highly expensive computing rigs into an affordable consumer electronic. Many dismissed the idea, but after a failed collaboration with Nintendo, the president of Sony at the time allowed Kutaragi and his team to continue working on the system in secret. It was an engineering marvel, and it changed the face of video games forever. But much has been written about the PS Classics software lineup, which is lacking iconic brands such as Crash Bandicoot, Gran Turismo and Tomb Raider. However, there's an argument that the PS1's library is so vast and diverse that a mere selection of 20 titles could never please absolutely everyone. I mean, I grew up on a diet of Medieval, Theme Hospital and Wipeout, while many others got their gaming education from the likes of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Chrono Cross and Vagrant Story. Whatever your thoughts on the microconsole's library, there are definitely some stone-cold classics included here. Metal Gear Solid, the tactical espionage action title from Hideo Kojima, is present and intact, and its crude visuals lend a je ne sais quoi to the cinematic ambition of the release. Resident Evil Director's Cut, with its hammy script and grainy voice acting, is still very much a survival horror masterclass, and of course Final Fantasy VII, with its pre-rendered backdrops, is just as inviting today as it was 20 years ago. But there's no doubt that the rudimentary 3D visuals of the PS1 era have aged ungracefully, especially when you compare them to the slick sprites of the 16-bit era. In games like, say, Battle Arena Toshinden, which was a launch title for the PlayStation and not a very good one at that, you can almost slit your wrists on the jagged edges as boxy character models float about pixelated arenas. Similarly, in titles like platformer Jumping Flash, it can be difficult to distinguish details, such as the extent of the dithering. But there's a definite charm to these basic looks. I mean, Destruction Derby impresses for a 1995 title with the sheer amount of activity occurring on screen, while fellow racing game Ridge Racer Type 4, for example, simply feels fast and responsive, which is actually something that many of the earlier PS1 titles like Rayman struggle with due to a hefty degree of input lag. Cool Borders 2, developed in Japan by WEP Studios, is equally imprecise, but its ostentatious anime style makes up for its shortcomings. I'd argue that the action games have aged the worst of the lot. Siphon Filter, the spy game from eventual Days Gone developer Sony Bend, is a surprisingly enjoyable third-person shooter with its multifaceted missions clearly inspired by GoldenEye 007. I mean, you can almost taste the Uncharted in the set-piece sequences, and playing it back-to-back with, like, the original Grand Theft Auto, for example, which is a kind of cumbersome, unwieldy open-world arcade game, it's hard to believe that Rockstar's series has gone on to become what it is. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six is another one that hasn't aged great. It's a first-person shooter with a tactical twist, and it's probably the most curious addition on the list. There are definitely likeable ideas to the game, like the fact that you can switch between operatives on the fly and design your own mission strategies, but it just doesn't feel like a classic in any sense of the word. And the same could perhaps be said of Twisted Metal, which was kind of the poster child of the mid-90s car combat boom, but it was massively improved upon by its subsequent sequels. Tekken 3 is definitely a game that deserves its place among the PS Classics roster, but it too feels a little bit slow and unwieldy compared to the fluidity of modern fighting games. I actually had a lot of the most fun with this playing the puzzle games. Intelligent Cube looks basic, but it's got a pretty cool concept, and Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo is probably the most overlooked inclusion on the PS Classic. It transposes all of the pizzazz of Capcom's one-on-one fighting brand to a tightly executed colour matching contest. The remaining games like Mr. Driller and Oddworld Abe's Odyssey are recognisable but perhaps somewhat uninspiring inclusions, and you could probably say the same for the JRPG editions in Revelations Persona and Wild Arms. You definitely get a taste of the origins of Atlus's mega franchise in the former, while the latter carefully bridges the gap between SNES era role-playing games and a newfangled polygonal future, but you can't help but feel that there probably could have been better picks in these departments. Ultimately though, I think Sony's done a decent enough job of mixing and matching genres and countries of origin to effectively showcase the diversity of the PS1's catalogue. There are a handful of titles here that feel like they're padding for sure, and none of the games necessarily hold up to modern scrutiny, but as a snapshot of the PlayStation, I genuinely don't think it's that bad. I mean, it is lacking when it comes to some of the console's biggest and best household names, and that's unfortunate, but it does feel representative of what the PS1 was. And I should note that all of the games appear to run and play as I remember them, although Digital Foundry addicts among you may want to look elsewhere for a more technical analysis of how the titles perform. It's really odd that some of the games utilise PAL code from Europe, while others are licensed by Sony Computer Entertainment America, especially seeing as I couldn't find there to be any real rhyme or reason behind it. I can't explain it, and I'll need to defer that question elsewhere, but it's something to keep in mind. So as a plug-and-play micro console, I think the PS Classic is generally successful at achieving what it sets out to do, but there's certainly an argument that Sony could have done even more here. The device looks good and it does exactly what it says on its nostalgic box. It takes you back to the 90s and allows you to play some of the defining experiences from the era in their original guise. The hardware's well made and the user interface is basic but very functional. By limiting itself to just 20 games, which is the same as competing miniature systems, the Japanese giant was always going to have its work cut out delivering a library that accurately reflects the PlayStation generation, and while key titles like Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil Director's Cut are present here, others like Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider are unfortunately absent. In the case of Gran Turismo and Wipeout with their licensed music, you can kind of understand why. Others, it's a little bit more difficult to understand the reasoning behind it. You could make a case that Sony could have built something on a much grander scale than the likes of Nintendo here, enabling access to the PS Store for future expandability, and even including online functionality in the form of, say, trophies and leaderboards, but all of this would have ultimately added to the overall price of the system. As a relatively cheap and cheerful stocking stuffer, there's more than enough nostalgia bundled in here to please players for a few weeks. So it depends what you're hoping to get out of it. I mean, I've personally had a lot of fun cycling through the software, reliving lines like the master of unlocking, and commentating with family and friends how far PlayStation has come. And while you can play through all of the games in their entirety, I personally feel that this product and its contemporaries are all banking on novelty. So as novelties go, if you grew up with the PS1 like so many millions did, the PS Classic represents a nice trip down a poorly textured memory lane. But let me know in the comments section below whether you'll be buying the PS Classic, which games are you most looking forward to trying on the micro console, do you have any questions about the system itself? I'd love to answer those. Let me know in the comments section below. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hopefully you found this video in-depth and informative, and yeah, thank you so much for watching.
This mansion is gigantic. We could get into trouble if we get lost. We should start from the first floor, okay? And Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.